Hello my friends, and welcome back to another Baldur's Gate 3 tier list and guide. Hope you're all doing well. Today we are covering every single consumable item in Baldur's Gate 3, or at least all the good ones. Over the last couple weeks I've gone through and individually rated each of the different kinds of consumable items in tier lists, and that has produced some 5-6 hours of video. Obviously that's a lot of information to take in at once, and it's very detailed, but I wanted to create this video as a one-stop shop where we can talk about all of the best consumable items, the ones that you should be collecting in order to use in your playthroughs, to give you an idea of exactly what you should be looking for as you go through the game. This will be very similar to how I structured it for my multi-classing tier lists and my spells tier lists, to condense this information down into a single video so that you have one place to go that will let you know whether something's worth picking up. Consumable items are incredibly powerful in Baldur's Gate and are involved in some of the most broken mechanics and most broken builds available in the game. And so it's very important for your honor mode runs to know which ones are worth picking up and using, how they work, because many of them work in odd or unintuitive ways, and sometimes the tooltips are wrong. I think these items were added late in development and didn't get the editing that other items got. So it can be very useful to know exactly how they work, and maybe that will help prevent the syndrome where you end the game with hundreds and hundreds of pounds of potions, scrolls, arrows, and barrels cluttering up your inventory, having never used them. As an inveterate collector of items that sit in my inventory just in case I need them later, I have found that this has been very helpful to me as well, to go through and systematize which ones are actually good and worth using, and so hopefully this can be useful to you to make your play through the game smoother. During these videos, I will be going through each of these in turn: elixirs, potions, poisons, arrows, and barrels. I did even rate the barrels, and talking about each of them, which ones are good, and I'll cover all of the S+, S, and A tier items in these tier lists, as well as any notable items that fall into lower tiers. Before I begin, I do want to take a quick moment to say thank you so much to Cosmic Fury for the $2 donation, Planet Axelrod for the $25, and Flimsy, Rob Gardner, and Peter Stott for becoming channel members. Thank you so much, my friends, and of course if I've mispronounced anyone's name, please do let me know in the comments. Alright, let's get into it and start rating all of the consumables. First up, elixirs. So I think that the elixirs are the most important of the consumable items to understand, because they are just so incredibly powerful, and often they can be worked into your actual character build and significantly change the way that your character is built, similar to equipment. In fact, elixirs are basically an equipment slot. Every character can have one of them running, and they last all day, so if you drink an elixir, it's the same as if you wore a pair of gloves. If you don't have an elixir running on a character, you're giving up as much power for that character as if they weren't wearing pants. And in fact, because Baldur's Gate combines the pants into the armor sets rather than having separate pants and shirts, you can conclude that Baldur's Gate characters think that drugs are more important than pants. So it really makes you think. The elixirs give you such powerful effects that last all day, and many of them can be purchased from merchants and stockpiled, so you can always have the elixir that you want most running. So it's very important to know which ones are good for which characters. All the elixirs function in the same way. They can be drunk as a bonus action, in which case the effects last all day, or they can be thrown, in which case you get a splash of the effect, so can hit multiple characters at once, but if you throw them, then the effects only last for 10 turns. Either way, the effect of the elixir replaces the effect of any previous elixirs that you have. You can only have one elixir running at a time, so knowing which character should get which elixirs is going to be very important. In an ideal scenario, you will have every character in your party running an elixir that is both powerful in and of itself and also very synergistic with that character's kit, so that you can maximize the power and synergy of your party. I've placed the elixirs into 6 tiers, including an F tier for elixirs that are actively negative, and an S+ tier for elixirs that operate outside the intended balancing of the game, and in some way break the sort of design and balance rules of 5th edition Dungeons & Dragons in a way that makes them way more powerful than they're supposed to be. In S+ tier, I have placed 4 elixirs, though you'll notice that I've divided Hill Giant and Cloud Giant Strength into 2 different use cases, which I'll talk about in a second. The first S+ tier elixir is the Battle Mage's Power Elixir. This gives you 3 stacks of Arcane Acuity, which lasts all day and doesn't decrease over turns, and doesn't decrease when you get hit, unlike normal stacks of Arcane Acuity. That's +3 to your save DCs and +3 to your attack rolls. This is the best elixir for control casters. Any caster that is going to be trying to lock down enemies wants the Battle Mage's Power Elixir. And also any caster that's going to be rolling attacks probably wants it as well, like warlocks or fire sorcerers, although sometimes they might want bloodlust instead. Battle Mage's Power is so powerful because it gives you +3 to your save DCs, which is like 7 levels worth of progression from a single item, and it stacks with all the other sources of Arcane Acuity to get to maximum stacks faster, and other sources of increased save DCs to reach the point where enemies simply cannot pass saving throws against your spells. At that point, any spell you have always succeeds. You can take bosses out of the fight immediately. Battle Mage's Power is completely broken for that reason. The only casters that might not want it are ones that can easily stack Arcane Acuity to maximum already, something like a Fire Sorcerer or a Swords Bard, but for any other control caster, this is the premium and go-to elixir. I'll talk about Vigilance next, because I'll talk about the Cloud Giant and Hill Giant ones in a second. But Vigilance is exactly the same as the Alert feat. It's +5 initiative, and you can't be surprised. Alert is the best feat in the game, and uses the numbers from tabletop Dungeons & Dragons unaltered, even though in tabletop, initiative is rolled on a d20, and in Baldur's Gate, initiative is rolled on a d4. That means that a character with Alert basically can't lose initiative in Baldur's Gate. If you go first, your enemies probably don't get a chance to go at all, and getting the best feat in the game for free from an item is obviously completely broken, so the Vigilance Elixir is an excellent elixir on any character, especially builds that are constrained and aren't able to take the Alert feat because they have more important things to pick up will want this one, and builds that are like multi-class so they only get 2 feats. Often the Vigilance Elixir is your go-to for those characters. Next, the Hill Giant Strength and Cloud Giant Strength elixirs. So the Giant Strength elixirs set your strength to 21 for the Hill Giant Strength or 27 for the Cloud Giant Strength, respectively. If used as a strength character, as I've placed them in S tier, these are just incredibly good. A strength character who starts with 16 strength, a +3 to strength, and drinks a Hill Giant elixir just gets +2 to their attack and damage for the entire day, which is an incredibly powerful bonus that is an absolutely go-to elixir that will massively power up your character throughout the course of the day, even if they already have high strength. Cloud Giant elixirs give you 27 strength, but are a relatively smaller bonus by the point in the game where you get them, but they also let you exceed the maximum attribute bonus that you are supposed to have, so they operate outside of the normal rules of the game in that sense, where you can just hit harder and do more damage than any other character in the game if you're using a Cloud Giant elixir. These are even more powerful with Tavern Brawler characters who double the bonuses again, given the bonuses that are already higher than they should have. Similar to the Battle Mage's Power elixir, a Hill Giant Strength elixir is worth like 7 levels of progression, because a level 1 character could have 16 strength. To get to 20 strength, you'd have to be at least level 8 and have invested 2 feats in it. So the ability to get that much strength without having leveled up that much is incredible. You'll notice a theme with the very good elixirs here, that they're worth levels and levels worth of progression on your character just on a single item. Where they get really broken, though, is and the S+ version of the Hill Giant and Cloud Giant Strength elixirs is where these fall, is if you use them on characters that want the strength, but on their character sheet have taken 8 strength, and do you just stockpile them and drink them every single day, basically getting 2 free feats and a whole ton of attribute points for your character for free. You can easily, in Act 1, stockpile enough Hill Giant Strength elixirs to last you the entire game. Merchants sell them. You can just long rest to refresh their inventory, go buy 3 more from Auntie Ethel, and then continue to do this until you have enough that you can just drink 1 every day, and that completely removes the need for you to put points in strength at all on your character sheet. That's incredibly powerful and means that strength characters who abuse this system have some of the most powerful character builds in the entire game. It completely breaks the rules of how many attribute points you're supposed to get, how many feats you're supposed to get, and just how strong your character is supposed to be, and is way outside the intended balance of 5th edition, and it's where some of the most powerful builds in the game come from. Finally, in S tier, I've got the Bloodlust Elixir, which whenever you kill an enemy, gives you 5 temporary hit points and an extra action. Extra actions are ludicrously powerful, and so you may actually be wondering why this is an S tier and not S plus tier. And the answer is that while the Bloodlust Elixir is incredibly powerful and is absolutely the go-to elixir for any character that's going to be regularly killing enemies, you do have to actually kill an enemy to get the bonus action, which means that the fight already has to be going well for the Bloodlust Elixir to do anything. So in fights where things are going worse, the Bloodlust Elixir is less powerful. That doesn't mean that it's not incredibly powerful still. Extra actions are incredibly strong, and normally there are very few ways in the game to get them, and ways that you have to invest very heavily into in terms of having haste or an equivalent or something like Action Surge. And even on Honor mode, where you can't make additional attacks, you can't use the extra attack feature with the Bloodlust bonus action, you can still do tremendous amounts of additional action economy, additional damage, and so on with the Bloodlust Elixir. In general, if your character is a high damage character, especially if they're a high damage spellcaster, the Bloodlust Elixir is going to be your go-to, because it just means they get to be hasted in something like 50% of turns, and that is which of course stacks with actual haste as well, and that is an incredibly powerful effect. You effectively get like 1.5 characters for the price of 1 when you're regularly killing enemies and have the Bloodlust Elixir on the field. Especially for warlocks or fire sorcerers who can land killing blows pretty regularly if you're spec'd into doing Eldritch Blast damage or spec'd into doing fire damage, that kind of thing, or lightning characters who are just one-shotting enemies with their lightning shots. The Bloodlust Elixir is going to be incredible. Less useful for spellcasters, but very useful for control spellcasters or support spellcasters, but very, very useful for martial characters, even despite only getting 1 additional attack on Honor mode, and obviously insanely powerful on Tactician mode or below, and even more powerful for spellcasters who are getting kills. So of these elixirs, your go-to for control casters is the Battle Mage's Power Elixir, for damage casters, the Bloodlust Elixir, for strength characters, the Hill or Cloud Giant Strength Elixir, and for characters that aren't able to work alert into their class, the Vigilance Elixir. In A tier, I've placed 4 more of these elixirs. The Supreme Arcane Cultivation, which gives you an extra 4th level spell slot for that day. Colossus, which gives you Enlarge for the entire day, which stacks with the normal Enlarge. Heroism, which gives you Bless for the entire day, which stacks with the normal Bless. And Viciousness, which gives you +1 to your critical hit chance. Arcane Cultivation elixirs are very good for their actual effect. Just 1 extra 4th level spell slot in a day is pretty powerful, especially for something like a cleric that might just want another 4th level Spirit Guardians or something like that. But also, the Arcane Cultivation elixirs have the unique effect amongst elixirs that you can benefit from them and another elixir in the same day, because you can drink the Arcane Cultivation elixir, cast the spell that it gives you, and then drink a second elixir, which will effectively give you a free spell. That can be used for day-long buffs. Something like a 4th level Aid from the Supreme Arcane Cultivation elixir is very powerful. Something like a Nature's Ally summon from a druid, a woodland being summon from a druid, can just really power up your character, and then you can also still benefit from another elixir. But even just as a default use, the Supreme Arcane Cultivation elixir is very, very good. Also worth noting with these that the real trick with the Arcane Cultivation elixirs is that you can drink them and then turn that spell slot into sorcery points if you're a sorcerer, and then drink another one and repeat ad nauseum until you have effectively infinite sorcery points, provided you've collected enough of these. So that's also just a useful trick that you can do with the Arcane Cultivation elixirs. Colossus Elixir gives you Enlarge, which in and of itself, being bigger is useful in some circumstances, but mostly this is just 1d4 extra damage on all of your attacks. While that will typically be less additional damage than the Bloodlust Elixir or the Strength Elixirs, that's still a lot of additional damage, and especially for builds that are getting frequent critical hits, where you double up on that, or builds that are making a lot of attacks in a round, the Colossus Elixir can be very, very good. So it's usually used as a backup damage option if you're out of Bloodlust Elixirs for that character, but still there are some characters that really want it. The Heroism Elixir, which just gives you an extra d4 to your hit chance, is even better than that in terms of damage output typically, because hit chance is really, really strong. And to be honest, the only reason that the Heroism Elixir and also the Colossus Elixir aren't in S tier is that the Bloodlust Elixir is typically better for damage-dealing characters. Both Colossus and Heroism are excellent for any character looking to make attacks, but typically those characters will also be looking to kill enemies, and so will get even more benefit out of the Bloodlust Elixir. But both Colossus and Heroism are incredibly strong. Sometimes Heroism can be the go-to elixir if you have a character that wants to land attacks, but not necessarily kill enemies. Something like a Sentinel fighter who gets a lot of utility out of just hitting the enemies with their Sentinel attacks. Something like a rogue for whom you can land a lot of poison attacks, and so you're getting most of your damage from the poison and not actually getting the kill until the poison goes off later on. Those are potential options for the Heroism Elixir. Most of the time the Bloodlust Elixir will supersede it, but Heroism is still just an amazing elixir that's very, very good, and you'll never be sad to have it running. Finally, the Viciousness Elixir increases your critical hit chance by 1, or decreases the number that you need to roll to get a critical hit by 1. And that can be very useful for characters that want to get critical hits. Things like Paladins or Rogues that benefit really strongly from critical hits will get extra damage out of this. Now, typically this is going to be worse for increasing your damage than Bloodlust, Colossus, or Heroism. The extra critical hit chance, even on characters with very high like smite damage, will not be as much average damage as those other 3 elixirs. But where Viciousness really shines is for characters who have special effects on critical hits, like for example a Great Old One Warlock who fears enemies when they get critical hits. Making that happen more often can be absolutely worth your your elixir slot, and the Viciousness Elixir really shines there. It also has the problem of being somewhat hard to pronounce, Viciousness Elixir. Saying that like 8 times in the last 2 minutes was quite a tongue twister. Finally, from the lower tiers, I'm going to mention the Peerless Focus Elixir, which is very good for support casters who just want to maintain concentration on their spells. Sometimes that can be better than these other elixirs, though often you'll still prefer Battle Mage's Power or Vigilance on them, but Peerless Focus definitely has its place. And Resistance Elixir, whose main use is to be thrown before you go into a fight with an enemy that has a lot of 1 damage type. If you use, say, an acid resistance elixir before fighting on your whole party, before fighting an acid-themed encounter, then you can really make your party much more survivable. Defensive elixirs are typically not as interesting as offensive elixirs, because offense is usually better than defense, especially when you're building your strategy around it, but the resistance elixir does have its place in certain encounters. So, overall, this should give you an idea of just how powerful the elixirs are. So many of them boost your effective character level by like 7 levels, which is obviously an absurd number. Many of them stack with existing effects, and they give you just a tremendous amount of free stats over the course of the game. Absolutely important to use. Next, in our exploration of the consumable items, potions. So potions are similar to elixirs in that they are glass bottles full of liquid, but mechanically they actually act very differently. While you still drink them as a bonus action, unlike elixirs which have day-long benefits and work similar to an equipment slot where you can just choose what elixir you have equipped for the adventuring day. Potions give you either immediate effects, like a burst of healing, or a very short duration buff, and so will usually only impact one encounter, rather than all of your encounters for a single day. While elixirs have very high opportunity cost, because every time you use an elixir, that's a different elixir that you can't use, potions have almost no opportunity cost, because usually you can benefit from them with a bonus action, which is not in high demand for a lot of classes, or just drink them before combat starts and gain the benefits of the potion without having to spend any actions on it at all. In this way, potions end up being very, very powerful because they're so free to use. They either use a relatively small action on your part, or they cost no action at all. You can also use them by throwing them at allies, in which case they're slightly more expensive, but it increases the versatility of these items even further. Potions are going to be a core component of your battle strategies because they're just so free, and if you're not using potions regularly, you're just leaving value on the table because of the extremely powerful effects that potions can bring. Stockpiling and using the right potions, knowing which characters should carry which potions, is going to help you win difficult encounters that you just wouldn't otherwise be able to handle at the level that you're encountering them. And so knowing which ones are good and which ones are bad, very, very useful. Similar to elixirs, I've divided these into 6 tiers. In S+ tier, I have ones that just give you numbers that are way out of scale for the game and are just too powerful to be in a Dungeons & Dragons game. In S tier, I have potions that are ones you're going to be using all the time because they're just so incredibly powerful. You should always grab these when you see them. And in A tier, we've got potions that are going to be mainstays, but you won't necessarily be using them in sort of every single combat or just constantly the way you will with the S tier potions because of those S tier potions' extremely powerful effects. In S+ tier, I've placed the Potion of Supreme Healing, the Potion of Speed, and an item that you may or may not know exists in the game, the Throwables. Also, thank you to the person who pointed out that that's an anagram of the StarCraft character Zeratul, little Easter egg, so I was probably saying it wrong in my last video. Of these, the Potion of Supreme Healing is there just because the numbers are so unbelievably high. When you drink a Potion of Supreme Healing, you heal 10d4 plus 20 hit points, which is an average healing of 45 and a maximum healing of 60, and that's just so many hit points to heal in a single bonus action. That undoes an entire high-level spell from an enemy or an entire round of attacks from most enemies in the game in a single bonus action or a throw with the Supreme Healing Potion. That is an unbelievable amount of value to just be able to carry around all of the time. The number of times that this will make the difference between life and death will be incredible. It can let you tank through turn after turn after turn of incoming damage with impunity, especially when combined with damage resistance effects like Blade Ward or Barbarian Rage or anything along those lines. And so just the sheer numbers on this item are incredibly high. I mentioned this in my actual potions tier list, but a Supreme Healing Potion is the sort of item that in a tabletop campaign you would find one of in like a Dragon's Hoard, or for an incredible sum in a magic shop in a major metropolis. And so the fact that you can just have dozens of these coming out of your ears is absurd in Baldur's Gate 3, and being able to use such a powerful item basically at will is incredibly strong. The Potion of Speed gives you 3 turns of haste, which doesn't stack with normal haste, but haste is just a ridiculously strong effect, and bonus actions are incredibly good. 3 turns is long enough to last for most combats, and it basically is getting 2 characters for the price of 1 just by drinking a potion. You can drink this either before combat starts, or you can drink it as a bonus action on the first turn of combat to immediately get more actions, lets you cast 2 spells per turn, lets you make an extra attack per turn on Honor Mode, and multiple extra attacks per turn on Tactician or below. The Potion of Speed just does so much for you and is so incredibly powerful. The Throwables does the same thing as the Potion of Speed. It's slightly different because it's a drug rather than a potion, and so it has 2 main differences with the Potion of Speed, and then 1 incredible difference with the Potion of Speed. It gives you the same effect, but for only 2 turns instead of 3 turns, but also costs no action at all to consume. You don't spend a bonus action on the Throwables, you can just take it, so you can start combat and then still have your bonus action for other stuff. But the really important important thing here is that the Terrazul effect stacks with other sources of haste, so you can have double haste if you take a Terrazul and a Potion of Speed, or take a Terrazul and have the haste spell cast on you by an ally, and so you just get massive numbers of additional actions when you have this item. All three of these items are incredibly broken and power up your party enormously to have access to. Buy them every time you see them, craft them, steal them, whatever it takes to get as many of these as possible. They're super powerful and will make so many combats so much easier. In S tier, I've placed the Potion of Healing, the Potion of Superior Healing, the Angelic Slumber potion, and the Potion of Angelic Slumber, the Potion of Flying, and the Elixir of Universal Resistance, which, despite the name, is actually a potion. It only lasts for 10 turns. The Potion of Healing is so good just because it's so useful in so many situations. You can use it to bring a downed ally back to life by throwing it at them. You can drink it as a bonus action to put yourself over a health threshold from an incoming attack. Like, let's say you have 10 health remaining and your enemy does 10-ish damage. Drinking a Potion of Healing will just give you a whole extra turn of being alive, and you can do a lot with an extra turn of being alive. And also you can use these for very efficient out-of-combat healing to mean that you're not having to long or short rest all the time or spend spell slots on stuff. There's so many different uses for the Potion of Healing. Obviously, all of them involve restoring your hit points, but restoring your hit points is really good, and the game gives you thousands of them, so stockpile them and use them regularly. The Superior Healing Potion is similar to the Supreme Healing Potion in that the numbers are just so high on it that it's very much worth using. While it doesn't quite crack the broken level that the Supreme Healing Potion does, it will often undo an entire turn of actions from an enemy just with a single bonus action, so the Superior Healing Potion is incredible. The Angelic Slumber Potion puts you to sleep for 2 turns, and then at the end of those 2 turns you gain the benefits of a long rest, so you fully come back to full health, you gain all of your spell slots back and everything along those lines. It's hard to use in combat because you need to stay asleep for 2 turns without getting hit, because that'll wake you up. But there are ways to do it, like with Sanctuary. You can drink an Angelic Slumber Potion and then Sanctuary your ally if you really need to gain back all of that ally's resources and can have the rest of your party survive for 2 turns in combat. But mostly this is just useful to prevent you from having to long rest, and that's just really, really good. If there's one character who's used a lot of resources, you can restore all of their resources before you have to go into the next fight, and so the Angelic Slumber Potion is just extremely powerful for improving your party's longevity, but also has a lot of very very powerful utility in combat, provided that you can keep your character asleep for the full 2 turns. Potion of Flying gives you the best mobility in the game. While the Fly spell itself is not very strong because it costs a 3rd level spell slot, the Potion of Flying costs no spell slot. It just costs drinking the potion, and so is going to give you effectively free Misty Step every single turn, because you get to move 60 feet with your just with your movement speed. The Flying Potion is the game's best mobility, is the tool in the game that gives you the best mobility out there. Incredibly powerful for any fight where you're going to have to be moving around frequently, which is a lot of fights, especially in the late game. Helps you get to enemies who you otherwise couldn't reach. Also has a lot of out-of-combat utility to reach areas that you couldn't otherwise reach. Extremely powerful. Getting a 3rd level spell just for the cost of a potion is ridiculously strong, and you'll notice that similar to the elixirs, a theme of the potions that are really powerful is that they just replace high-level spells just for the cost of an item, so effectively for free, and that's something that's really good to be doing. The Universal Resistance Elixir only lasts for 10 turns, so it's different from a normal elixir in that it works the same as a potion and different from an elixir. And you can use it and other elixirs, so don't worry about accidentally canceling your elixir if you drink the Universal Resistance Elixir. It's not actually an elixir. It just gives you damage reduction, damage resistance to every damage type for 10 full turns, which is very powerful. Now, obviously, you will typically want offensive tools over defensive tools in Dungeons & Dragons, but defensive tools, especially damage resistance, which is incredibly strong as a defensive tool goes. Having incoming damage means that it will take twice as long for you to die, and also doubles the value of, for example, all of these healing potions that you have access to. And so for difficult fights, the Universal Resistance Elixir can be very, very powerful. Definitely one to stockpile and use for difficult fights. Because it lasts for 10 turns, it's easy to pre-buff with, so you can drink it before combat starts. And then it will just keep your party alive even in the most difficult encounters in the game much more easily. I'm also just realizing now that I meant to move one of the potions that I have in A tier up to S tier, that being the Invisibility Potion, based on the excellent community feedback that I got on this potion's tier list. Enough people pointed out a lot of great uses for the Invisibility Potion that I think it definitely deserves to be bumped up a tier into S tier. Not only does it give you tremendous out-of-combat utility, where you can position your character before fights start, you can go through areas that are normally restricted or guarded with impunity. It also works very similar to Sanctuary, where you can use it as a panic button. Your character can take their turn, and then if they're in a dangerous situation, just drink the invisibility potion. Very few enemies in the game will be able to see them when they're invisible. Not many enemies have invisibility. And so the invisibility potion can often be a potion of invincibility for a turn, which is an incredibly powerful tool to have at your disposal. Also, of course, it has bonus effects where you can use it to make sure that your rogue is hiding so they can trigger sneak attack and so on like that. But the primary uses are either for out-of-combat utility or for a character who just needs to be invincible for a turn because they're out of position or in a bad situation. So having one of these as an emergency backup tool on every character can really make your party that much safer, which of course is the goal of these potions, is to use them when you need them, and the invisibility potion comes up often enough and has a powerful enough effect, definitely worth stockpiling as many as possible. And in A tier, I've placed the Gaseous Form Potion, the Glorious Vaulting Potion, Greater Healing, the Remedial Potion, and the Angelic Reprieve Potion, which is different from the Angelic Slumber Potion. Gaseous Form might look like an odd inclusion in A tier because the spell itself is pretty weak, but again, this is a third level spell that you are getting in the form of a potion. Gaseous Form as an effect is actually pretty cool. While it shuts you down in combat, there's a lot of neat uses you can use it for. Obviously, there's the out-of-combat uses, like going through the small pipes or cracks or whatever in the game that you need to be small or incorporeal in order to pass through. But there's also a lot of cool combat uses that you can make use of, even though it turns off your ability to attack. It makes you completely immune to ground effects, so you can, for example, float out over lava while in gaseous form, lure enemies into hazardous locations, group enemies together because it makes you resistant to damage over like an Evard's Black Tentacles or something like that. You can also use it to trap enemies in bad situations because you can pass through any grates, any door that isn't solid, so a grate or gateway or anything, you can pass through when you're in gaseous form. So you can use it to trap enemies on the other side of those and then just shoot them while they are helplessly stuck on the other side of the door. You can then lock that door with like an arcane lock or something to trap enemies on the bad side of a grate or gateway. Gaseous form can be used to really help with reaching areas you wouldn't otherwise be able to reach, with trapping enemies in hazardous locations, with trapping enemies in all sorts of cool effects. While this isn't the most flashy or powerful effect, it is extremely versatile, and the number of uses are limited mostly by your creativity, which is the type of effect that I really like, because you can find really interesting strategic options with the Gaseous Form Potion. I talk about more potential options in my potions tier list, but that's the basic overview. Glorious Vaulting is the same as the Enhanced Leap spell, so it's just a potion of jump, and jumping is really good. Triple jump distance is super powerful in Baldur's Gate. It's similar to flying in that it just gives whoever drinks it basically free Misty Step every turn for a whole combat, and that's very powerful. The one downside of this is that because it costs a bonus action to drink, and it takes a bonus action to jump, you usually can't use it in the same turn you consume it, so you're going to want to use it pre-combat. But mobility is king in Baldur's Gate because positioning is king in Baldur's Gate, so Glorious Vaulting helps with that and is very useful. Greater Healing is another healing potion. I've bumped it down a tier, even though obviously it's more healing than the healing potion. The Greater Healing potion, I think, is not enough more healing that it's worth going out of your way to stockpile these specifically. You will, of course, upgrade to the Greater Healing potion as you find them, but it's less of an impactful item when you get it than the other healing potions. So while it is a strictly better item, I think it's less important to pay attention to the Greater Healing potion specifically. Still obviously excellent and has all of the uses of the healing potion, but only more so. Just less important to specifically get Greater Healing potions because the numbers aren't enough better that it matters that often. The Remedial Potion cures you of a bunch of very dangerous effects, which as a bonus action is very useful. Being able to remove blinded, silenced, or poisoned with a bonus action is very powerful when you're afflicted by any of those effects, and being able to throw it at an ally to remove Paralyzed is very good. Paralyzed is the most dangerous condition in the game, the most debilitating condition in the game, so being able to remove it from allies is extremely powerful and worth carrying these just for that use case of throwing at a paralyzed ally. And then Angelic Reprieve is similar to Angelic Slumber, where you sleep for 2 turns and then you get the benefits of a short rest instead of a long rest. You also get all of your first and second level spell slots back. That's still very good and can still vastly improve the longevity of your adventuring days and heal your characters, give you a bunch of spell slots back. Less useful because you won't reset like 6th level spells or super high level effects with the Angelic Reprieve potion, but still very, very powerful. And there are some characters that actually prefer it. For example, a sorcerer can spend all of their 1st and 2nd level spell slots to turn them into sorcery points, drink an Angelic Reprieve potion, and still have those sorcery points. Whereas if they tried that with the Angelic Slumber potion, the effects of the long rest would make the sorcery points go away. So there are some characters that prefer the Angelic Reprieve, but for the most part it's just a slightly weaker version of Angelic Slumber, which still makes it excellent. Notable ones from other tiers include Animal Speaking, which can replace the need to take Speak with Animals as a spell, and Mind Reading, which can do a similar thing with Detect Thoughts, but both of those are available very easily, so I'm not too worried about stockpiling these potions. And Basilisk Oil is useful for precisely one story event, but otherwise doesn't come up for the most part. Overall, with potions, what you're looking to do is use them to power up your characters for difficult fights, and so the high-tier potions are just going to give you such an enormous boost to your character's effectiveness at almost no cost that they're absolutely worth stockpiling, and any fight where you drink a bunch of potions should be a fight that you win, because if you drink the right potions, they're just so powerful. They're also really good for panic buttons. Invisibility, flying, supreme healing, all of these can get you out of bad situations. So potions like Speed and Terrazul can really be powerful can power up your character and be used offensively, and then there's also a lot of really powerful defensive options. So potions just run the whole gamut of powerful effects and are a core part of any combat strategy. Next up, grenades. So grenades and bombs in Baldur's Gate 3 can be thrown using an attack action and then explode wherever they land. That means that for spellcasters, they usually take your whole turn to use, and for martial characters, they usually take half your turn to use, although an exception to this is specifically Berserker Barbarians, who can throw items as a bonus action and can use grenades even more effectively than other characters. What this means is that grenades are primarily useful in the early game, in a lot of cases, or if you have like a spellcaster who doesn't have a relevant spell to cast on their turn, they can gain a lot of benefit out of having a stockpile of grenades so that they can still be contributing in that combat even if they don't have a particularly relevant spell. Often a grenade will just be a way better use of your action than a cantrip would be, so you can gain a lot of benefit by having the right grenade stocked on the right allies. Mostly though, these are useful in the early game where you have just incredibly high where the damage values still keep up, and so they can actually be more damage than your normal attacks, or they can just be a lot of utility. They give you AoE before you get easy access to AoE, so they give you a lot of early game options in terms of how your combats will go, as well as often having value on into the late game. I will say that overall, it's less important to carry and use grenades than it is elixirs and potions. If you completely ignore grenades, you won't lose as much as if you completely ignore those other two. But they can still go a long way towards making your party much stronger, and especially getting you through the most difficult part of the game, the first, 3 to 5 levels, because that's at the point where grenades are at their strongest. The other important thing about grenades is that the damaging grenades can be used to cheese certain encounters by dropping them all on the ground and then setting them all off at once in order to just one-shot enemies. I'm not going to be considering that use case, but it is important to know that that's something you can do for especially hard combats. But we'll be rating them as though you're actually throwing them in combat. In S tier, I've placed the Smoke Powder Bomb, the Humble Bottle of Water, the Haste Spore Grenade, as well as the unique Haste Spore Flask, the Sanguine Explosive, and the Flash Blinder. The Smoke Powder Bomb does 3d4 plus 9 force damage with a dex saving throw to have, and for the most part the dex saves on these items are very low and enemies will pass them very frequently. But half damage isn't 0 damage, so the Smoke Powder Bomb will always do a pretty reasonable amount of damage. 3d4 plus 9 is 16.5 average damage, so still 8.25 when halved in an AoE. And guaranteed damage is just always valuable. The ability to just do damage without having to roll any dice for it is just very powerful, and not normally something that your characters get access to other than with higher level spell slots. And so having with leveled spell slots, you need to cast at least a level 1 spell. So having a Smoke Powder Bomb so you can do this in effectively a resource-free way can really help you finish off low health enemies, do guaranteed damage to large groups of enemies. Just very powerful to be able to hit a large AoE with a decent amount of damage. And it will just be a very effective tool, especially in the sort of early to mid game. Often it's more damage than your character would just be able to do on their turn, so it just replaces your normal turn with a better turn, and that's something that's very good for a consumable to do. Water has infinite uses, and I will not be able to go through them all in this video without keeping you here for 6 hours, but a bottle of water in Baldur's Gate is one of the most powerful items in the game. It gets enemies wet, which causes them to take double damage from lightning and cold damage, so any party that's doing either of those damage types wants to stockpile water so that you can immediately destroy enemies. Doubling damage is ludicrously powerful. You can use it to snuff torches, you can use it to put out fires on your allies, you can also use it to give yourself damage resistance from fire when you're going into fights with enemies that do fire damage. You can use it to create puddles of water on the ground, which you can then electrify or, most importantly, freeze, causing enemies to suffer the effects of those surfaces. The bottle of water has so many uses, and they're all so good, you should carry dozens of these and use them frequently in combat. Haste Spore Grenade creates a cloud in which any character who enters it will become hasted for 3 turns. Obviously, haste is one of the most powerful effects in the game. We've talked about that with the Speed Potion and the Bloodlust Potion already, so the ability to just cast haste on your whole party for the cost of a single attack action is very powerful. The downside of the Haste Spore Grenade is that enemies can use it too. If they walk into the haste spores, they will also get hasted, but just being able to haste your entire party with a grenade is so strong that it's going to easily win you whatever combat you use it in, because your party's just going to be operating at double effectiveness for that combat. The Sanguine Explosive is gated behind a story event. It's only available in Act 3, but it does 4d8 force plus 4d8 fire damage with a saving DC with a dex save to have, and inflicts burning on whatever enemy that's hit by it. That's the 4d8 plus 4d8 is 8d8, which is more damage than a fireball, so you're basically getting a 4th level spell slot for free when you throw this item. As we saw with the potions, any item that gives you a spell for free is very, very powerful, and this one gives you more damage than a fireball in a 20-foot radius, so it's a bigger radius. So you're basically getting a souped-up fireball for free with a single action when you throw the Sanguine Explosive. Similar to the Smoke Powder Bomb, it does guaranteed damage because it's just a dex save for half. It's a DC 17 dex save, so enemies might actually fail the dex save, and the AoE is enormous, so you can really use this to do extra damage. This will often be the best action that you have available in combat, because it's equivalent to a 4th level spell, roughly, and that is a very powerful resource to be able to just have at your fingertips at all times, and will easily win you combats if you use these, especially if you use them on a character who can use multiples of them in a turn. A fighter throwing 3 of these in a turn is going to nuke down any encounter almost immediately, so the Sanguine Explosive is just completely encounter winning whenever you use it. The Flash Blinder is another Act 3 only item, and it blinds enemies in a 20-foot radius with a DC 15 con save to negate. In and of itself, that's not very good and doesn't deserve the S tier, but the secret effect of the Flash Blinder is unbelievably powerful, and that is that if you hit a Steel Watcher with it, and that's any kind of Steel Watcher, it gets stunned without a saving throw for a full turn. On Honor Mode, it's 1 turn. On Tactician Mode or below, it's 2 full turns of stun, and a no-save stun is an unreal powerful effect. Normally you spend a 6th level spell slot on Otto's Irresistible Dance to get 1 turn of no-save stun on a single enemy. The Flash Blinder is AoE and get multiple turns of stuns without a save on some of the more dangerous enemy types in the game, and so that can easily win you those encounters. The Flash Blinder, therefore, is incredibly strong for the late game, and absolutely something that you should carry. Whenever you're fighting a Steel Watcher, you'll be very, very glad that you have it. Mostly you aren't going to use this in non-Steel Watcher fights, because the effect just isn't that good outside of it, but for the Steel Watcher fights, it's insanely strong. Alchemist's Fire is mostly useful in the early game. So in A tier, I've placed Alchemist's Fire, the Grease Bottle, the Void Bulb, and the Web Grenade. And Alchemist's Fire is mostly useful in the early game. It lights enemies on fire, which will then deal them 1d4 damage on each of their turns, and creates a fire surface underneath them, which deals 1d4 damage when it happens, and then also will deal them more damage if they pass over it or end their turn on it. So it's at least 2d4 damage, guaranteed, and again, guaranteed damage is very strong. In the early game especially, enemies will often live with like 3 health, and an Alchemist's Fire can take out 2-3 health enemies without too much trouble, without having to roll dice for it or anything, so that's very, very useful. And in the early game, if you hit lots of enemies with this can often be a very damage-efficient turn that you take. If you do 2d4 damage to each of 5 enemies, that's way more damage than you're able to do with like a level 2 character otherwise. So the Alchemist's Fire can be very powerful both for shutting down low health, for killing like low health enemies, and just for doing decent damage to a large group of enemies. The Grease Bottle creates a grease surface. It's the same as the Grease spell, but slightly smaller AoE, and it's only DC 12 compared to the Grease spell, but Grease is still just a very powerful effect. It's difficult terrain, so enemies will move at half speed on it, and that's without a saving throw, and they also have to make a saving throw or they fall prone. Enemies who fall prone on their turn lose the rest of their turn, and they're going to have to repeatedly make this save as they pass over the grease, or when you throw it at them, or if you push them back into it or whatever, so you can shut down entire encounters with the Grease Bottle, especially in the early game. You can also light it on fire for a little bit of extra damage. Typically you won't want to do that because it's better to just have the grease effect out there, but it's good to know when you just want an extra d4 of damage and for some enemies to be on fire, the Grease Bottle works similar to Alchemist's Fire in that way. The Void Bulb pulls all enemies towards it, which is a pretty cool effect. It has a 20-foot radius, which is very powerful, and which is obviously huge, and deals 1 force damage, 1 guaranteed damage. I know I've been singing the praises of guaranteed damage for this entire section, but 1 guaranteed damage is nothing to write home about. But then enemies have to pass a strength saving throw or be pulled towards the center. The strength save is DC 18, so a lot of enemies are going to fail that strength save against the Void Bulb, and pulling enemies towards the center can group them for AoEs, can pull them down off cliffs, can do all kinds of horrible things to them, pull them into hazardous terrain or hazardous effects that you've set up. The Void Bulb is just an amazing setup item that can completely group a pile of enemies to then just obliterate with an AoE effect. The large radius and high save DC means that you can easily reposition a lot of enemies with it, and that's a very powerful thing to do. The web grenade is the same as the level 2 spell web, but with a lower save DC, but web is just a very, very powerful spell, and being able to just cast a level 2 spell with even with a relatively low save DC on the web grenade is still just very useful. You can trap enemies inside it, they'll have to continuously make the save or become immobilized and webbed, which gives them disadvantage, gives you advantage on everything, and that's just a very powerful effect against enemies, even with only a DC 12 save. Just if you can catch like 1 or 2 enemies in the web grenade, it's still very good overall, and because they will often be in it for multiple turns, it can be very useful. Also can be used to burn, to light enemies on fire, or as a discount featherfall, because if you drop down onto a web, you don't take damage, so if you just need to featherfall your whole party, the web grenade is there for you. In lower tiers in this section, there's not actually a lot that are particularly worth mentioning, although I will say the Scrap and Shrapnel Grenade and the Spiked Bulb inflict bleed with no saving throw, and bleed halves enemy con saves, so if you really want to land a poison or a con save targeting effect, the ability to easily inflict bleed can be very powerful, so those are useful for that. And the Sleeping Potion is here because even though you can technically drink it, it's mostly used to throw at enemies because it just has a negative effect. Sadly, that negative effect isn't very good. Overall, with grenades, you're mostly using them to help carry you through the early game, and they are very, very powerful for that, although some of them, like the Flash Blinder, Sanguine Explosives, Haste Spore, and Water, are still really excellent in the late game. But using grenades regularly when you have a character that doesn't have something better to do, or just need a little bit of a boost to get through an early game fight, will make your honor mode runs much smoother, because they won't as often end early on, which is the most dangerous point for those runs. Next up, poisons, oils, and coatings. So the poisons, oils, toxins, weapon coatings are typically applied to your weapon, but all of these work in slightly different ways. Oils can only be applied to your weapons, poisons can be applied to your weapon, or can be thrown at enemies to make a cloud of poison. But if you do that, it usually has a worse effect than if you hit them with the weapon attack. For example, it might have a lower save DC or a lower duration, and so usually you're going to want to use poisons as actual weapon attacks, and then toxins can be applied to your poison, but you can apply to your weapons. But you can also throw them at enemies where they make a puddle, where they take the toxin effect if they stand in it, or you can apply them to your whole party's weapon, because your party can use the dip action to apply it to your entire party's weapon. So these all work mechanically slightly differently. I go over in detail how each of them work differently in the poisons, oils, and coatings tier list. But bear in mind that all of these can at least be applied to your weapon, and then you can attack an enemy with it, and that is the primary use case for most of them, so it's the one we're going to mostly be looking at. Like Elixirs, the main opportunity cost of these is that if you use it, you can't use a different one. Weapons can only have one coating at a time, and so we're just looking to have the most efficient use of our weapon coatings, because weapon coatings are also a strict advantage. Anytime you're attacking with a weapon, which in Baldur's Gate 3 is going to be a lot, it's just better to attack with a poisoned weapon. So anytime you're attacking with a non-poisoned weapon, you're leaving value on the table because you are just making a worse weapon attack than if you had poisoned that weapon. So choosing the right oil, the right poison for your weapons can really help power up your characters, and for difficult fights these can be very important, especially because some of them have incredibly strong effects that boost your characters significantly. Again, I will say that like grenades, if you completely ignore this mechanic, you are losing less than if you ignore potions or elixirs, but you're still losing a lot, and we want to optimize as much as possible, so let's talk about them. In S tier, I have placed the Diluted Oil of Sharpness, the Oil of Accuracy, the Crawler Mucus and Carabacin's Poison, which are the same thing, and the Oil of Combustion. The Diluted Oil of Sharpness gives you +1 to attack and damage with the weapon that you apply it to, and that +1 to attack and damage stacks with any other sources, like the weapon's enchantment itself, any bonuses to attack and damage you have from party member buffs or other items or anything like that. It will stack with the Diluted Oil of Sharpness. +1 to attack and damage is just darn good. I mean, that's a lot of damage. It basically turns a an epic weapon into a legendary weapon. And obviously that's very powerful in and of itself, and a legendary weapon into a super legendary weapon. You can easily reach hit chances and damage values that you shouldn't, that you normally wouldn't be able to reach if you stack a lot of this type of effect, and the diluted oil of sharpness is very good at just increasing your damage. Not much to be said about this one. +1 to attack and damage is very good. Getting it for 10 turns is very good, so you should use it a lot. Oil of accuracy is similar, except it just does +2 to attack and not which is even better. Typically bonuses to your hit chance are better than bonuses to your damage, because bonuses to your hit chance scale off of the base damage of your weapon. So if you have a weapon that does 20 damage, the oil of accuracy is going to increase every attack you make by an average of 2 damage, because it just increases your hit chance by 10%. And that is going to be incredibly valuable. Hit chance scales both with having lower hit chance, so like the lower your current hit chance, the better increasing your hit chance is, and with damage. So it's good in the early game when you have low hit chance, and it's good in the late game when you have high damage. So Oil of Accuracy is just always really, really good, and is going to increase your damage massively. The Crawler Mucus paralyzes enemies on a DC 15 Constitution saving, DC 13, excuse me, Constitution saving throw. While that's a relatively weak saving throw, enemies will pass that pretty easily. This is one where you can cause enemies to bleed, so they have disadvantage, and just the effects are so debilitating that it's absolutely worth using anyways. You get to try it once against each enemy in a combat. They do get inoculated against the effect if they pass the save, but a roll against a DC 13 or instantly lose the combat for an enemy is still a pretty good effect to have when it doesn't cost you an action at all, because you're just getting this for free on your weapon. So even though the Crawler Mucus won't work incredibly often, when it does, the effect is so debilitating that it's incredibly strong. The Oil of Combustion is a weapon oil, so you use it on your weapon, and then when you hit an enemy with it, they, with no saving throw, get doused in flammable oil, of the coated in oil of combustion effect, and then when they take any fire damage, they explode for 3d6 fire damage to themselves and nearby allies. This, if you can apply it with a weapon that has additional fire damage somehow, normally you can't apply it to a burning weapon, but if you have like a pair of gloves that deals extra fire damage or something like that, then it'll explode immediately, just adding 3d6 of extra damage to all your attacks. Also, if enemies are grouped up together and you hit them with an AoE effect that applies this, like a Hunter's Volley or a multi-target arrow that we'll talk about in the next section, then you can chain these effects together. Each of them will set off the other explosions, doing damage that increases with the number of enemies in the area, so you can do incredibly high damage if you just hit a bunch of enemies with the Oil of Combustion all at once. But even aside from that, you just deal 3d6 extra damage with all of your attacks when you Oil of Combustion, explode it, Oil of Combustion, explode it. That's ridiculously strong and absolutely worth the effort. More for ranged characters than for melee characters, but still very important. Arsonist's Oil strips off enemy fire resistance. There's a couple weird tricks you can do with this that I get into in more detail in my oils and coatings tier list. You can go check that out. But the main thing is that if you hit an enemy with fire resistance with Arsonist's Oil, they lose fire resistance. Obviously critical if your party has a fire damage character in it, and saves you a feat if you have enough Arsonist's Oil and a character that can apply them easily. Then you don't have to take Elemental Adept on that character, which is great, because then you can take a better feat. But also, most parties are just going to do a decent amount of fire damage incidentally. You will have things like Oil of Combustion or just various sources of fire damage that are available to pretty much every party, and so having the Arsonist's Oil can increase your damage significantly even if your party isn't spec'd into doing fire damage. Most parties will do enough fire damage that it's worth hitting fire-resistant enemies with regardless. The Drow Poison in A tier also has another pretty debilitating effect. It's a DC 13 saving throw or they fall asleep. Obviously that's less of a painful effect than the Crawler Mucus, but again, this is mostly just a a low chance against every enemy in a combat to instantly remove them from the combat, which is very powerful. One thing to keep in mind with the Drow Poison is that if you have an attack that does multiple damage instances in the single attack, like sneak attack damage added on as a reaction, it will wake the enemy up immediately, so some characters won't be able to use the Drow Poison, but for ones that do, it's very powerful. You can put it on an arrow of many targets and try it against every enemy in a combat all at once, and just save or instantly lose the combat is a very powerful thing to get for free. There are, I believe, no items in the lower tiers that are particularly worth going out of your way to pick up here. All of these have some uses, but they're not particularly notable. The Oil of Bane can be somewhat useful just because it can let you land a spell land a spell against an enemy with a decent saving throw. It can penalize them. But for the most part, you are looking at the high tier poisons here, and especially the oils that just increase your chance to hit and damage, because those are incredibly valuable. Oils are just a pretty solid boost to a character for one combat, and very worth using for difficult combats. Next up, arrows. So you might think that arrows are only useful for archery characters, which would of course make logical sense, but actually in Baldur's Gate, arrows are extremely useful both for archery-focused characters and for non-archery-focused characters. Any character, or almost any character in the game, will have some sort of ranged weapon equipped. They can carry a bow, in addition to their melee weapon set, and so the ability to fire some of these special arrows at any point is very useful even for non-archery focused characters. Many of them have their effects, even if you don't actually hit an enemy with them, and so you can use a character's turn to land the cool and powerful effects of these arrows, even if they have never before touched a bow in their life. An archery-focused character gets more uses and can use more of them, of course, because many of them are based on the character's base damage, but don't forget that your other characters can use them basically as grenades or as extra spells, because that will come up very frequently. Similar to poisons, arrows for an archery-focused character have almost no cost for their use, just opportunity cost of not using a different arrow. They require no additional action to use and are used using your normal attack. So anytime you are attacking with a ranged attack, it's just better to attack with a special arrow ranged attack. And using the right ones in the right situations can power up your characters massively. For archery-focused characters, this is a huge component of Baldur's Gate. And in my opinion, one of the really fun things about Baldur's Gate is getting to mix and match the right arrows for the right situations to do really cool and powerful things, while you're also doing a ton of damage shooting an enemy. In S+ tier, I've placed the arrows of Darkness, Many Targets, Smoke Powder, and Sparrow Slaying, because these are all arrows that break the game in some way. The Arrow of Darkness duplicates a level 2 spell, so you're basically getting a level 2, if you fire it on a character who wants to hit enemies normally, you're getting a level 2 spell for 0 actions, because you would have been attacking with an arrow regardless. And Darkness in Baldur's Gate is just incredibly broken. You can use this to cast on your allies, and then they are immune to ranged attacks. You can see through it if you have a Warlock or some way to gain blind immunity, and then it's just very, very powerful. You can check out my Darkness Party guide called The Best Evil Party in Baldur's Gate 3 to go over all of the many, many uses for the Darkness spell, but suffice to say, Darkness is incredibly broken, providing complete immunity to ranged attacks, shutting down enemies completely in various situations, and the ability to apply it without spending concentration on it, without spending a spell slot on it, and without really spending an action on it is incredibly powerful, so it makes the Darkness arrow very, very useful. This is one that is often used not by archers as well. You can just have this as an extra cast of Darkness on any character that wants to cast Darkness. They can just shoot a Darkness arrow at their own feet, saving themselves the concentration and the level 2 spell slot on Darkness. And if they have multiple attacks in a turn, sometimes it also saves them a half a turn as well. So the Darkness arrow is just very powerful because of how powerful the Darkness effect is. The Many Targets arrow is incredibly busted. It hits up to 4 targets, so it'll hit a primary target and then up to 3 secondary targets. It does half damage to each of the secondary targets, at least on paper, but the damage that's halved is just the base damage of your weapon. No damage riders or additional damage that you're doing, or importantly things like sharpshooter, get halved. So for the most part, the damage reduction is going to be extremely minimal, and firing a many targets arrow is just dealing 4 times as much damage, or like 3.8 times as much damage as you would with your attack normally with a single attack. It's also even more broken than that, because it applies all of the on-hit effects of your attacks to all 4 of those targets. If you have a poison, like we talked about in the previous section, then you can poison 4 enemies at once with it. And there's also a bug where if you critically hit with a many targets arrow, every subsequent attack in the chain becomes an automatic critical hit under, I think, most circumstances. I've seen it sometimes not happen, but it happens like most of the time. So you're going to get a lot of free criticals out of the many targets arrows as well as of the date of recording. All of these things combined are incredibly powerful, even without the broken nature of the math and the broken nature of the critical bug. The intended effect of this arrow, just quadrupling your action economy for a turn, is insanely strong, and the fact that it multi-applies poisons or on-hit effects is ridiculous. The only downside is that you can't use it alongside some kinds of special attacks, like a Swords Bard's slashing flourish, but the many targets arrow is just incredibly broken for any archery character, and will be the mainstay of your archer for most of the game. Smoke Powder Arrow is another one that explodes where you hit. It does 4d6 force and 4d6 fire damage with a DC 15 dex save for half, and also knocks back enemies with a DC 15 dex save to negate. That is basically a fireball. It's a slightly larger AoE than a fireball as well, and so you're just getting a 3rd level spell for a consumable item, which, like we talked about in grenades, is a very, very powerful option, even for characters that aren't wanting to fire arrows normally. So for a spellcaster or a melee character or whatever, just the ability to cast a fireball with your attack action is incredibly strong. It doesn't cost you a spell slot. For an archer, it's even better because it's a 0-action fireball. A 0-action fireball is exactly as good and as powerful as it sounds. Smoke Powder Arrow is insane. Sparrow Slaying Arrow, of course, is incredibly broken for obvious reasons. We don't even need to go over how good that one is. In S tier, I have placed the arrows of acid and ice, as well as the undead, aberration, and humanoid slaying arrows. So the slaying arrows just double your damage on that attack, so only useful for characters that are spec'd into archery, but they will just do twice as much damage as you would normally do. It doubles all your base damage and all your on-hit effects, so it will just do twice as much damage as you normally would in 2 separate damage instances, which is also good for things that care about like number of times you hit an enemy, like arcane acuity stacking, or on-hit effects like radiant orbs or whatever, all get to double dip on the slaying arrows. You can only use them against the enemy type of they are targeted against, and doing double damage to them is obviously very good for fights against those enemies. So the only question about the slaying arrows is just how many of those fights and how important are they in the game. Undead are very common enemies, humanoids are the most common enemies, and this campaign is about fighting aberrations, so obviously those are all very important arrows for us. The acid arrow might look like an odd inclusion in S tier because it's a very low level arrow. It's one of the first that you get. But the thing about the acid arrow is that while it does have a dex save or they take 2d4 damage, that's not the main effect. That is a tiny bonus that you don't really care about. But the main effect is that it creates an acid surface at the location. An acid surface with no saving throw causes enemies standing in it to have -2 AC. So if used as the first arrow in a volley, you just get +2 AC to the rest of your attacks +2 to hit to the rest of your attacks that turn. +2 to hit is the same as the Oil of Accuracy, or the Archery Fighting Style, which is the most powerful fighting style in the game, and one of the main reasons to be an archer in the first place is how good that is. So the Arrow of Acid just giving you free +2 to hit on like half of your attacks in a given turn is a very powerful tool, and one that you should absolutely keep in mind. Also, often your first attack in a round will be your most likely to hit, because you'll be firing it with advantage from hiding or whatever, so you will boost your attacks that are less likely to hit, which is even more powerful. The Acid Arrow, because it has no saving throw, is just really good for that reason. The Ice Arrow is an ice surface, and ice surfaces in Baldur's Gate are always incredible. This one has a low save DC, so enemies won't fall over that often. But again, we're not spending a turn doing this, so the ability to, with no action, just give an enemy a chance to fail a saving throw and instantly lose their turn is similar to the Drow Poison or the Crawler Mucus from the Poisons tier list, just really powerful because it comes at no cost. So even though this has a relatively low chance of succeeding, any chance of doing something that comes at no cost to the player is incredibly strong. Ice arrows are going to be very useful all through the game. Also, ice arrows are the core of a bunch of combos because when you hit ice with fire, it turns into water. When you hit water with something, it turns like back into ice or into lightning. So you can, for example, go ice arrow into fire arrow into lightning arrow to make an ice surface that knocks an enemy over, then turns into a puddle, then becomes electrified to do combos of arrows together for even cooler effects. And the ice arrow is usually the starting chain in that combination. At this point, if you watched my previous arrows tier list, you'll notice that a couple have moved around because I took into account what people were saying in the comments, and I really appreciate everyone's feedback. I want to have the most accurate list possible. So a couple arrows that have moved around. I moved the Ilmater arrow up from B tier to A tier. I moved the Dragon Slaying arrow down from A tier to B tier, and I moved the Monstrosity Slaying arrow up from C tier to B tier, just based on the frequency of those combats. In A tier, we've got the Fire Arrow, the Ilmater Arrow, and the Slaying Arrows for Constructs, Elementals, and Fiends, the sort of next most common types of fights and the next most difficult types of fights. But the only new arrow types are the Fire Arrow and the Ilmater Arrow. Fire arrows are very good because they create a fire surface at the location, which is just a guaranteed d4 damage, plus maybe some more damage if the enemy burns for a long period of time, and even more damage if they fail the DC 12 dex save against the fire arrows on hit effect. The damage from this isn't very powerful, but guaranteed damage is really good and just something that we are always on the lookout for. So the fire arrow will be very useful just to do guaranteed damage in an AoE around the target, and that can kill low health enemies. It can massively increase your damage output if a bunch of enemies are clustered. Fire arrow for that reason is pretty nice in especially the early game. As the game goes on, it is going to lose effectiveness, much like the other sort of guaranteed damage sources, but guaranteed damage in the early game can kill enemies. And of course the fire arrow has the other uses of lighting things on fire. The ability to light flammable surfaces, to light explosives, to burn, to melt ice surfaces has a ton of utility all throughout the game, and the fire arrow gives you easy access to that. If you shoot an enemy who's standing on a flammable surface with the fire arrow, the surface will catch fire, so you can get that for free with some additional, without costing you any turns. Obviously, you'd get a fire surface from the arrow itself normally, but it can light like a big surface or something like that. There's a lot of utility options that will come up with the fire arrow constantly over the course of the game. The Ilmater arrow I've moved up to A tier because I think I underrated it slightly. It does a d4 of extra necrotic damage, which is not that much damage, but is notable in that unlike the others, it doesn't have a saving throw associated with it. It just does the extra d4 of damage, and that d4 of damage can be multiplied by critical hits and other effects that you might have if you are landing an Ilmater arrow on enemies, and then it stops that enemy from healing for a full turn. The preventing an enemy from healing against enemies that heal or regenerate regularly can often be like 20, 30, 50 damage, depending on how much healing they do. And so that is pretty nice. The Ilmater arrow also is a way to do just a little bit of additional damage without an AoE effect. All the other extra damage arrows, like acid, ice, fire, and lightning, have an AoE. And so you can fire the Ilmater arrow safely into melee without hurting your allies, which is definitely a relevant effect as well. Mostly, though, it's going to be used for certain encounters where the enemies have a lot of healing, and you just want to shut that down, and the fact that you can do that with no saving throw is very, very strong. Notable arrows from other tiers. I'm going to mention the Arcane Interference arrow because it looks like it should be really good, but the silence only lasts for 1 turn and disappears at the beginning of the enemy's turn, so they're never actually silenced by the Arcane Interference arrow when they want to cast spells, but you can still use it to break concentration or stop them from counterspelling stuff. And I will also say that one of the most common pieces of feedback, or most vocal pieces of feedback I got on my arrows tier list was the Roaring Thunder arrow. There's a lot of big Roaring Thunder fans out there, and so I do want to do them justice. I don't believe that the Roaring Thunder arrow is particularly good because of the low saving throw, and because, unlike the other arrows, it often costs you a turn to use, because in order to direct the knockback to where you want enemies to go, sometimes you have to actually not shoot the enemy, and in which case you're giving up damage. And it's a DC 12 strength save, which most enemies will pass on like 60% of the time. So it's never worth firing not at an enemy to try to get the knockback effect. But if you fire it at an enemy and the knockback is relevant, it can still be good. The chance of it actually going off is pretty low because the save DC is so low, and that's why I personally don't value it. But I do want to say that there are many people who really like the Roaring Thunder arrow, so you may want to experiment with it and see if you are one of them. Overall, the arrows are very, very powerful because they have so little cost associated with their use. You can, anytime you would be firing an arrow normally, you can massively improve your party's power by firing a special arrow, especially the broken arrows at the very top of the scale. But also they just give you a few free spell casts on characters that aren't even spec'd into archery and can really amp up the power of your party, just having these available for every character. If they don't have anything good to do on their turn, throwing a fireball or a darkness can still be a very useful effect, even if they aren't actually ever going to hit things with their arrows. And then for archery-focused characters, of course, the arrows are an incredible boost to the effectiveness of that character. And finally, we're going to talk about all the barrels in the game, because yes, I did do an hour-long video rating all of the barrels in Baldur's Gate 3, because that's just the kind of person that I am. Barrels, it must be said, are typically used to cheese encounters through so-called barrelmancy, because like grenades, you can set up a big pile of them, explode them all at once to one-shot an enemy. And that's the way that they're most commonly going to be used, I think, in general. But even if you're not cheesing encounters, the barrels can actually be very powerful tools during combats. They can be thrown or placed and then set off during combat, just by virtue of careful positioning and spending move speed or actions to run up, drop a barrel, and then run away and then blow it up when you're safely out of the range of the effect. And so the barrels can give you a lot of value over the course of the game. The main challenge of these, of course, is that they're very heavy, so you need to have the carry weight to make use of them, but some of them are just so powerful that it's very much worth carrying them around and using them in combat, in order, especially for very difficult encounters. In S tier, I have placed the Firewine Barrel, the Rune Powder Barrel, and the Rune Powder Bomb, which are functionally identical items, the Smoke Powder Barrel, and the Water Barrel. Firewine barrels are full of explosive alcohol. When they take fire damage, they explode in a 20-foot radius for 4d6 plus 18 fire damage, with a dex saving throw to do half damage. And funnily enough, the dex save on the Firewine Barrel actually uses your character's save DC. Most of the consumable items in the game use a fixed DC, but the explosive barrels use your character's save DC. I'm not entirely sure why they did that. My guess is that they didn't put that much thought into how they were coding the explosive barrels because they didn't expect them to be a core component of too many people's strategies. The Firewine Barrel damage is very good. 4d6 plus 18 is better than a fireball, so even if you're spending a turn on it, it can still be very much worth spending that turn. You can also throw it to get an alcohol surface, a 20-foot radius alcohol surface, which you can either set on fire or freeze. The ability to make a 20-foot radius ice sheet is sometimes worth the multiple turns that it takes you if you throw the Firewine Barrel and then freeze that surface, that can still be an incredibly useful effect in some combats. Mostly you're going to be using this for the damage, but there's definitely some times where you just need an ice surface, and the Fire Wine Barrel can make that happen for you. The fact that it does so much damage and creates a big burning area, and that burning area does even more damage to enemies, just means that the Fire Wine Barrel is worth a lot of damage, especially in early game encounters. There are some early game fights that this will just one-shot every enemy in the fight, or just bring every enemy that's not the boss to almost 0 hit points, and that can make a lot of early game fights much easier. You can set these up in the arena before you fight, or you can use them by walking up, dropping them, running away, and then setting them off with a fire arrow or a firebolt or something like that. All of those are great options. They can be used to add damage to your AoE spells, because if you catch an enemy in the AoE along with the Fire Wine Barrel, like if you hit them with a fireball and then the barrel explodes, then you just double fireballed them, and that can be pretty good as well. The Rune Powder Barrel and Rune Powder Bomb do a tremendous amount of damage in a vast AoE. It's a 59-foot radius AoE. So funnily enough, because it's 59 feet and not 60 feet, you can actually technically stand outside the radius and set them off with a firebolt, which does actually have a 60-foot range. But the chances of doing that are low, and the game's hitboxes are finicky enough that I don't recommend doing that in actual combat. But when you do, it does 10d8 plus 40 force damage, which is an average of 85 damage, and a maximum of 120 damage, with a dexterity saving throw to have the damage. And that will just destroy almost any enemy immediately. The 60-foot radius will one-shot encounters, so anytime you can find a way to safely set off the Rune Powder Barrel, you can win that encounter immediately. It's also, because it's force damage, double damage against objects, and completely ignores their hardness. So any encounter that involves you trying to break an inanimate object, the Rune Powder Barrel can do that immediately. If there's, for example, a big room full of inanimate objects that you need to break in order to win a certain encounter, then you can blow up the Rune Powder Barrel, one-shot all of them, and make those encounters significantly easier. The Smoke Powder Barrel is similar in that it does 4d4 plus 18 force damage, so significantly less damage in a 20-foot radius, a significantly lower AoE, but also creates a big fire surface, a big smoke powder surface that then explodes for even more force damage, 2d6 force damage with no saving throw, and then 2d6 fire damage with a dex saving throw to half. Then that also catches fire. Enemies in it are also knocked back, so this is a no-save knockback with no save. So this is a no-save knockback, which is a pretty cool effect for an item to have, just being able to reposition enemies with no save. But mostly it's just that the amount of damage this does is extremely high, because it does the initial damage, and then the explosion damage, and then the burning damage. You get several instances of damage, so you'll probably get like 40 damage per enemy out of the Smoke Powder Barrel, which is enough to clear a lot of encounters, even on into the late game. And the ability to use this to just one-shot whole encounters is very strong. You can also throw it to get the smoke powder surface, and then just set off that surface for the explosion damage, 2d6 fire and 2d6 force with a no-save knockback attached. So you can use this at range if you throw it, break open the barrel, and then set it on fire. Water Barrel is similar to Water Bottle, but more so, because it's a barrel and not a bottle. It makes a 20-foot radius wet effect, so if you hit an enemy with it, everything within 20 feet becomes wet. Makes a 20-foot radius puddle, which you can then turn into ice or electricity. So the Water Barrel is like the Water Bottle, limited only by your imagination in terms of how powerful it is. Water effects are some of the most powerful effects in Baldur's Gate 3. My favorite use for a water barrel is to throw them with a Berserker Barbarian, because you can throw them as a bonus action, get the whole enemy squad wet, and then follow up with lightning damage, which is one of the core combos that I discuss in my Blaster Party build, which you can check out under the best Blaster Party in Baldur's Gate 3. But there are lots of uses for the water barrel, because water surfaces are just so incredibly strong in Baldur's Gate. The Rune Powder Vial and Smoke Powder Satchel are basically explosive barrels. They're satchels rather than barrels, and the game does classify them as grenades, but they don't go off when you throw them. I've placed them both in A tier because they are similar, just explosive damage when hit with fire, but they do a little bit less damage than the S tier items. The Rune Powder Vial, there's only one of in the game as well, so when you use it, it's gone forever. It also is worth noting that the Rune Powder Vial has a larger AoE than the indicator on the game. It explodes in a 21-foot radius AoE, and it shows the normal 7-foot grenade indicator. So do be aware that when you use the Rune Powder Vial to explode enemies, it will explode a lot more than it looks like it's going to. But this is just another very powerful explosive, 5d4 plus 18 with a dex save to half, and a no-save knockback, similar to the Smoke Powder Barrel. Obviously, that's very good. So it is very high damage, but doesn't have the use case of being able to throw it like the Smoke Powder Barrel does. And then the Smoke Powder Satchel is very similar to that as well. Both of these doing a no-save knockback is quite powerful and is the main use for these two items. The damage is good and is pretty nice to do AoE damage, but since it will take you your action to throw it and then your action to set it off, you mostly are going to use it if you have set up a situation where the knockback is good, but knockback plus damage is so powerful that it's often worth setting up that situation to use the Smoke Powder Satchel or the Rune Powder Vial. Alright, my friends, I hope that you've enjoyed this look at all the consumable items in Baldur's Gate 3, with the exception of some unique items that can't be stockpiled, so I didn't include them in the rating. I guess there's also one kind of consumable item that I didn't cover in this video, which is scrolls, but of course I did an entire spells tier list, so if you're interested in spell ratings, go check that out. I think that consumable items occupy a really interesting spot in Baldur's Gate because some of them completely change the way that the game is played once you start using them, and so hopefully this has given you the tools that you need to be able to know which ones are good, use them more effectively, and enjoy the game more because you just have more tools at your disposal, and hopefully it helps solve the problem that many gamers have where they stockpile consumables forever and never use them. I've already heard many people saying that they have started using like potions or whatever after watching my previous tier list, so hopefully even more people this will help. Alright, my friends, if you've enjoyed the video, please feel free to leave a comment and like the video. Both of those things help me out a ton with the algorithm. And if there's anything you think I got wrong or misplaced, if there's justice for any consumable that you are looking for, definitely let me know in the comments. As you've seen, I'm very open to feedback, and if there's something that I think should be changed, I will happily change it. So let me know if you think there's anything that should be moved. And of course, if you've enjoyed this video, you can subscribe to my channel for more Baldur's Gate 3 strategy guides and other strategy game content. Cheers, folks. I'll catch you next time.